The concrete was still wet from melting snow when the door shut behind me, the sound echoing down the alley like a verdict. My phone vibrated once in my hand. The screen cracked, my breath coming out in white clouds as I stood there with nowhere to go and everything suddenly gone. The city felt louder than it ever had, yet no one looked my way, and that silence hurt more than the cold. If you have ever been blindsided by someone you trusted, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from, because stories like this happen in quiet places no one talks about. I remember staring at my reflection in a darkened window, trying to understand how a marriage could end without a fight, without a warning, without mercy. My keys were useless. My name no longer belonged where I had lived, and standing there, shaking. I didn't know yet that this moment was only the surface of something much deeper. That was the night everything I believed about love, safety, and myself began to unravel. I was standing barefoot behind my apartment building in downtown Cleveland, the cold concrete biting through my feet, when I realized I had nowhere left to go. A trash bag had split open nearby, spilling damp cardboard and something sour into the night air, and that smell settled into me faster than the shock did. 10 minutes earlier, I still believed I was married. My name is Emily Carter, and at that moment, I was crouched in a service alley, arms wrapped around myself, trying to understand how a life could be stripped down so cleanly. The windows above me stayed dark. Cars passed at the end of the block, close enough to hear, far enough to pretend nothing was happening. I had been pushed out without noise, without witnesses, without dignity. The cold made my hands shake, but it was the silence that hurt more. No one asked where I would sleep. No one checked if I was safe. I was simply removed, like something that no longer belonged. I kept replaying the last few minutes inside the apartment, searching for the moment I must have misunderstood. I pressed my heels against the wall, stared at the cracked pavement, and tried to slow my breathing, wondering what had happened inside that door to make this ending feel so deliberate. An hour earlier, I was still inside the apartment, standing in the living room where the lights felt too bright and the air too tight. Nothing was playing, no television, no music, just the sound of my own breathing reminding me I was being watched. The papers were already on the table when I noticed how quiet everyone was. I remember realizing, with a dull heaviness, that this was not a conversation. It was an announcement. The decision had been made long before I walked into that room, and my presence was only required to formalize it. I felt surrounded, not physically, but emotionally, boxed in by calm faces and rehearsed patience. As I flipped through the pages, I understood what they were designed to do. No assets, no claims, no questions, a clean erasure. I was told, without words, that resisting would only make things harder, uglier, more public. Silence was being offered as mercy. My hands shook as I signed, not because I agreed, but because I could feel the ground disappearing beneath me. I wasn't losing a marriage in that moment. I was losing permission to exist in the life I had built. When the pen left the paper, something settled inside me. This wasn't sudden. It was the final step of something that had been wearing me down for years, quietly, patiently, until there was almost nothing left to push out the door. At last, alone. For 5 years, my marriage did not fall apart loudly. It thinned, quietly, the way fabric wears down until light passes through. I learned the rhythm of the house early, what time dinner should be ready, how certain moods meant silence, how asking questions could shift the air for days. At first, I called it adjustment. I told myself love required flexibility, patience, effort. I stopped buying things just for me. I rearranged my schedule around his needs. I learned to apologize quickly, even when I could not name what I had done wrong. Each compromise felt small, reasonable, temporary. But the rules kept changing. What pleased him one week annoyed him the next. Praise happened privately, dismissal publicly. Affection became conditional, something earned through compliance. When tension settled in, it was never addressed. It was withheld, used as pressure until I folded. I grew quieter without noticing. I dressed differently. I laughed less. I defended him when friends asked careful questions, because admitting the truth felt like admitting I had failed. I believed endurance was proof of character. Leaving felt selfish. Staying felt responsible. When we struggled to have a child, the distance hardened. Touch disappeared. Conversations shrank to logistics. I carried the disappointment alone, convinced my body was the final problem I needed to fix. I worked harder, hoping effort could replace warmth. Looking back, the most damaging part was how normal it all felt. Nothing exploded. Nothing forced me to run. I stayed because the erosion was gradual, and because leaving would have meant naming the loss out loud. By the time I was pushed out, part of me already recognized the feeling. That familiarity made the alley feel less like an accident and more like confirmation, a final scene that matched the quiet exits I had practiced emotionally for years. Without realizing, I was rehearsing the end long before it finally arrived in my life then. I sat on the cold concrete with my back against the brick wall, knees pulled in, trying to make myself smaller than the night. The alley smelled like damp cardboard and old oil, and every sound felt louder than it should have. My hands shook so badly I had to press them together just to feel them. The cold crept in fast. It settled into my feet, my spine, my thoughts. I kept checking the dark opening at the end of the alley, half expecting someone to appear, half terrified that no one would. Being unseen hurt, but being seen like this felt worse. My phone lay beside me. Its screen cracked, the corner splintered but still glowing. It felt ridiculous that something so fragile was the only thing keeping me tethered to the world. I stared at it, remembering a promise I made years ago to never ask for help, to prove I could stand on my own no matter what. Sitting there, that promise felt heavy and useless. Independence had started to sound a lot like isolation. Survival suddenly mattered more than pride. I picked up the phone with numb fingers and made the call I had avoided for years. When it connected, I said where I was and nothing else. After that, all I could do was wait. Then, far down the alley, a soft glow appeared. When the light reached the mouth of the alley, it did not rush. It widened slowly, steady and deliberate, followed by the low sound of an engine that felt controlled, not frantic. Headlights washed over the brick and trash, and finally over me, turning the night into something visible. A car stopped a few feet away, then another. Doors opened without urgency. The air shifted. Men stepped out and positioned themselves between me and the street, not blocking me in, but shielding me. No one stared. No one asked questions. That restraint told me more than words could have. A coat was placed around my shoulders, heavy and warm, and for the first time since leaving the apartment, my body reacted before my mind. I started shaking harder, not from cold, but from relief I had not allowed myself to feel. I was guided to my feet carefully, like I mattered. As I moved toward the car, I realized this was not kindness by chance. This was response. Someone had come prepared. Someone had decided I was worth finding. Inside the car, the door closed with a solid sound that cut off the alley completely. Warmth filled the space. The city slid past the window as we pulled away, and I did not look back. The trash pile stayed behind. The silence stayed behind. Whatever power I had lost there no longer followed me forward into a future finally safe. When we arrived, the house was already lit, standing quiet behind iron gates and tall trees, untouched by the noise of the city. Stepping inside felt like crossing a line I had forgotten existed. The air was warm, steady, ordered. Nothing rushed me. My grandfather was waiting near the entry, not sitting, not asking questions, just present. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, but solid in a way that made everything else slow down. He did not demand explanations. He did not search my face for blame. He opened his arms, and the decision was made for me. I broke there, not from fear, but from permission. I cried the way you do when you finally stop holding yourself together. He let me, steady and silent, reminding me without words that I was home because I belonged, not because I had earned it. Later, wrapped in a blanket, hands warming around a mug I barely tasted, I felt something unfamiliar settle in, safety without conditions, strength without punishment. For the first time in years, I did not need to defend myself. When my breathing slowed, his focus shifted, calm and precise. What happened mattered, but not for shame or revenge. It mattered for truth. As the house settled into quiet around us, I understood this was not just refuge, it was the beginning of clarity, and tomorrow we would open every door that had been closed to me. I sensed that answers, once hidden, would finally surface, and I was no longer afraid of what they might reveal there. Morning light filled my grandfather's study, steady and pale, the kind that makes everything feel honest. I sat across from him at the desk, a thick folder placed between us, unopened, waiting. He did not rush me. He waited until I felt grounded enough to look. When I opened it, the first pages felt ordinary. Names, dates, accounts. Then my name appeared again and again, attached to transfers I did not recognize. Month after month, money had moved quietly out of an account held in trust for me and into accounts controlled by my husband and his family. I felt a cold pressure behind my eyes, not panic, just disbelief settling into shape. That trust had been created years before, meant to give me stability, not luxury. I had never accessed it directly. I had been told finances were handled, that things were tight, that sacrifice was necessary. The folder showed something else entirely. The apartment, the lifestyle, the calm confidence I lived under had been funded by me, without my knowledge. As I turned the pages, patterns emerged. Failing businesses masked as investments, losses hidden behind reassurances. The warmth I lost when I could not give them a child made sense in a way that hurt differently. Usefulness had always been the measure. The most unsettling part was how clear everything became. I was not foolish. I was selected. My patience, my silence, my trust were not accidents. They were resources. The shame I carried for years loosened its grip. In its place was clarity, sharp and steady. I closed the folder knowing I would not disappear quietly again. What had been taken would be reclaimed, starting with my own name. I understood that truth was protection, and understanding it meant I no longer needed permission to stand alone. I was offered quiet, time to recover, space to stay hidden, permission to let everything pass without explanation. For a moment, that sounded tempting. Silence had kept me safe before, or at least I believed it had. But sitting there, with the folder still heavy in my mind, I understood what hiding would cost. Disappearing again would let someone else define what happened to me. It would leave their version standing while mine stayed unspoken. I had already learned how that story ends. Choosing visibility did not feel loud or dramatic. It felt deliberate. I decided to stand in my own name, calmly, without accusations or spectacle. A brief acknowledgement was made, factual and restrained, confirming my return and my role. Nothing emotional, nothing defensive, just presence. The response was immediate in subtle ways. Messages arrived from people who suddenly remembered me. Conversations shifted tone. Somewhere, doors closed quietly while others opened without effort. I did not celebrate any of it. I observed. What surprised me most was the calm. Speaking without anger stripped away fear. I was not trying to punish anyone. I was refusing to vanish. That distinction mattered. Once visibility replaced silence, there was no reversing it. The truth no longer depended on my endurance. It existed on its own, steady and visible, and I could feel the consequences beginning to move, slowly and inevitably, toward the people who had relied on my absence to remain untouched. That shift marked the moment I stopped surviving quietly and started existing openly, without apology or retreat from my past. After I chose visibility, things did not collapse loudly. They shifted, slowly and methodically, the way structures fail when support is quietly removed. Contracts were reviewed, deadlines questioned, and agreements that once felt permanent began to loosen. None of it required my voice or my presence. I watched reports arrive with steady language and neutral conclusions, each one peeling back another layer of illusion. Businesses missed obligations, loans tightened, and partnerships dissolved without ceremony. What surprised me was how little emotion it stirred. Once I stopped protecting what was built on distortion, gravity took over. I did not make calls or issue warnings. I simply allowed processes to do what they are designed to do. At one point, his name appeared on my phone. The sound no longer carried urgency or fear. I let it pass, understanding that silence can be a boundary, not a weakness. Distance had done what confrontation never could. The unraveling continued without my involvement, quiet and efficient. Only later did I realize this was just the surface. Financial consequences were visible, but patterns were beginning to show beneath them. What collapsed first was money, but truth was close behind. I could feel that there was more to understand, more connections waiting to be exposed. The silence had revealed more than noise ever could, and as one structure fell away, another story was preparing to surface. I stayed observant, grounded, and intentionally still, letting the next truth come to me instead of chasing it. That restraint felt like the final proof that I was no longer entangled. Whatever followed would not shock me, because I was finally looking at my past without illusion. The collapse had cleared the way for recognition, and recognition was already unfolding. I was ready to see it clearly at last now. I thought the worst truth had already surfaced, but it had only opened the door. As the review continued, more names appeared, not accusations, just patterns. Women connected by timing, by language, by the same promises reshaped for different faces. Each story followed a familiar arc: intense attention, quick trust, subtle control, finances handled for them, doubt reframed as loyalty. When resistance appeared, warmth withdrew. When usefulness faded, so did commitment. Seeing it laid out removed the last question I had been asking myself. I met some of them quietly, not to compare pain, but to compare reality. What struck me was how similar our confusion sounded, how often we blamed ourselves for being sensitive or demanding. None of us were reckless or naive. We were targeted because we were capable, patient, and willing to believe. As the pattern sharpened, shame lost its grip. This was not a series of misunderstandings. It was a system that depended on isolation. Each woman thought she was alone, and that belief kept the structure intact. Recognition changed everything. Once the pattern was visible, it stopped feeling personal and started feeling solvable. Manipulation thrives in silence, but it weakens in shared clarity. I did not feel rage. I felt responsibility, not to expose a person, but to expose a method. Keeping this truth private would only protect the next version of the same story. Speaking openly was no longer about me. It was about ending the isolation that allowed it to continue. That realization marked the moment I chose clarity over fear. Finally, together. I did not raise my voice when I decided to speak. I chose a small, neutral space. Nothing dramatic, nothing performative. I spoke the way records speak, steady and factual, letting patterns stand on their own without decoration. I did not name out of anger or retell moments for sympathy. I described sequences, behaviors, timelines. I explained how trust is manufactured, how control hides inside patience, how silence is mistaken for loyalty. The absence of emotion made people lean in rather than turn away. What surprised me was the response. Messages came from strangers who recognized their own lives in the structure I described. They were not looking for outrage. They were looking for language. Calm truth gave them that. In that moment, I understood the difference between endurance and dignity. Endurance keeps you alive inside harm. Dignity requires you to step out of it and speak clearly, even when your voice shakes quietly inside. When I finished, there was no rush of victory. There was relief. My body felt lighter, as if I had set down something heavy I had been carrying for years. The truth no longer belonged to my silence. I knew then that speaking this way carried consequences beyond reputation. Calm exposure does not invite argument. It invites reckoning. And once truth is spoken without anger, it cannot be dismissed as emotion. Something irreversible had shifted. There was one last attempt to scare me. It arrived quietly, dressed as urgency, hinting at consequences if I did not retract what I had said. Months earlier, that message would have sent my heart racing. This time, my body stayed still. I read it once. I noticed the familiar pressure, the suggestion that compliance would make everything easier. Instead of responding emotionally, I paused. I forwarded it to my attorney and documented it the way I had learned to do. No explanations, no reactions, just process. The tension rose for a moment, then flattened. Nothing exploded. No confrontation followed. The system absorbed it the way it was designed to. For the first time, I trusted that I did not need to defend myself personally to be safe. What surprised me most was the absence of fear. I felt alert, not panicked, grounded, not small. I realized that growth is not loud. It is quiet competence under pressure. When the threat dissolved into paperwork and deadlines, I felt something close. Not victory, not relief, but finality. The loop had ended. I knew then the story was no longer about survival or justice. It was about ownership of my life, and that meant I was ready to let the past stay. These days, my life looks ordinary in ways I once thought were impossible. Mornings are quiet. I drink my coffee slowly. I lock my own door at night and sleep without bracing for impact. Nothing dramatic announces that I am healed, but the calm itself feels like proof. For a long time, I believed closure meant winning, being believed, or watching someone else face consequences. What I learned instead is that revenge keeps you tethered to the harm, while closure loosens the knot. It arrives when your nervous system settles and your thoughts stop orbiting the past. Strength is not endurance. It is clarity. It is knowing when to stop explaining, stop absorbing blame, and stop shrinking to keep peace. The moment I chose clarity, my life expanded in quiet but permanent ways. If this story resonates with you, I want you to know something important. You are not weak for staying. You are not foolish for hoping. And you are not broken because it took time to see the truth. Patterns are designed to hide themselves. I am sharing this not to reopen wounds, but to name what so many of us experience in silence. If you have lived through something similar, I invite you to share your thoughts or your story in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. And if you are still in the middle of your own storm, let this be a reminder. Peace is possible. Not louder, not sharper, just real. Thank you for listening, for holding space, and for walking this story with me. If it helped you feel less alone, please like, subscribe, and stay. Healing often begins when we realize we are seen and that our voices truly matter.